From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to Face the State. I'm David Parker, MTN Political Analyst, and I'm here with MTN Chief Political Reporter Mike Dennison. The conventions are done, the dog days of summer are fading, and Montana's political campaigns are kicking into high gear. Congress is in the midst of its annual August recess, so it's great to have Congressman Ryan Zinke join us today for a chat. Congressman, great to see you again.
Great to be here with you.
So I got a question for you. One thing you've talked a lot about in your campaigns and in your career here in Congress is about leadership. And Dwight Eisenhower said there were 4 characteristics of leadership. He said character, ability, responsibility, and experience. In your mind, how does Trump fit those 4 criteria that Eisenhower lays out?
Well, certainly I think we live in a unique time in American history. Both sides of the aisle are upset. Status quo is not working and the government seems to be failing. And so Donald Trump has some assets. One, he's a business guy, disputed. And in the political warm-up, I think the Republican Party underestimated how upset America is. And America is, the American people are the last line of defense. So what Donald Trump has brought to the table is the end of political correctness. Now I don't agree with everything he says, but the fundamental message that Washington, D.C. is broke, status quo is not working for everybody, he brought that. Secondly, the immigration issue. We're watching what happens overseas in Europe, and there's concern in Montana about an unvetted immigration program, which we do at our own demise. And lastly, Donald Trump's a business guy. And everyone assumes that Donald Trump, as a successful business guy, will surround himself with good people. To your point, I think his leadership, he's got to do 3 things. Make America great for everyone, and he's got to focus on being inclusive. He's got to show discipline, because there's a difference between a candidate and a president. And lastly, he does have to surround himself with a leadership team like a Reagan stature cabinet to give some surety that the people around him are of quality and exhibit the leadership traits that America wants.
You said something that kind of piqued my curiosity, the end of political correctness. What does that even mean, and what is political correctness preventing us from doing or saying? I just don't really understand that.
Well, we face issues in our country, and what I've seen that oftentimes you're gonna walk around the subject but not get at it. And we do have a debt issue. We do have I think an issue abroad where our enemies don't fear us, our allies don't trust us, and we've gotten this is it politically correct, or are we going to address the challenges that face us? I don't think we can solve the problems unless we can identify it. Case in point, Islamic terrorism, that is a radicalization of Islamic. I have Muslim friends, but it is the extremism of that. And you can say that, because I think in order to address it, the radical Islamic terrorism is what we face. But yet there's a poll, don't say radical because you're going to upset the Muslim community. No, radical Islamic terrorism and ISIS and Al-Qaeda has killed far more Muslims than they have anyone else. And this is a worldwide issue and not just a Muslim issue or a Christian issue. This is a global issue.
There was a piece in Vox written by a former CIA analyst. Her name is Emily Nicola. I'm sure I just botched her name entirely. But she said she worked in the Bush administration and for the Obama administration. And it was a very careful reason why they didn't use the term radical Islam, and that's because moderate Muslim factions in the Middle East would hear that and be potentially disengaged. So it's very carefully contrived basically to make sure that the right audiences in the Middle East who support us don't hear us attacking Islam. So she says it made sense not to use that terminology.
Well, I disagree. As a former commander, actually, that has fought in Iraq, and I fought along with Muslims, with the tribes, the relationship between the military force at the time and the Sunni and Shia tribes. But what you have to do is you can't position it as a crusade, Christianity versus Islam. What you have to do is develop allies and position us where we're in this together. What we're fighting is an ideology that's evil. outside of the paradigms of religious context of Islam. I mean, when you're talking about ISIS beheading children and crucifying villages and entertaining a very violent and destructive ideology, that's outside the bounds of the number of Islam believers, either it's Sunni or Shia. But that's what you have to do as leadership, is convince our allies that we're in the fight to stay, that we face a common enemy. And the enemy isn't on religious boundaries, it's on evil versus good. And this is outside of human experience as I've known it since I've been around in overseas. I've never seen this type of evil before.
Now, you've been critical, of course, of the foreign policy of the president and Hillary Clinton. What do you think we should be doing that we're not to combat these forces in the Middle East?
Well, the Middle East is just one aspect of it. And I have been critical of this president because I think this president has created vacuums, and these vacuums are being filled. In the case of China, for instance, the vacuum that's being created in the South China Sea as China develops their coastal defenses and pushes our ability to have sea lanes, and then they're constructing islands in the middle of or in the south side of the South China Sea and fortifying them. That squeezes it. Our allies look at this as a retreat because the sea lanes are at risk, and the sea lanes are important. Trillions of dollars of services and goods go through those sea lanes. So that's an example. As you turn over to Eastern Europe, you see an aggressive Russia. I don't think Russia is our enemy per se, but they are an aggressor. And our allies in the Eastern Front are looking at that as well as the U.S. going to be there. Because we weren't there during the Ukraine, as Russia continues to expand, puts their flag in the North Pole, and finally you do a pivot to the Middle East. As bad as ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hamas and Hezbollah are, I think that the key and central danger still remains Iran. Iran continues to build and test ICBMs. Since the atrocious deal was signed, I think they have launched 7 ICBMs. One of them would destroy Israel, written in Hebrew on the side. They continue to violate UN sanctions, and we're not doing anything about it. Matter of fact, we're funding them in cases of $400 million in a pallet. I think that $400 million could have been spent here in much better.
So you want to revoke the Iranian nuclear deal?
I would tear it up in a heartbeat, because what it does is it sets a path to embolden Iran to have as many as 100 nuclear-tipped ICBMs in 13 short years. How? In 5 years, it relaxes all restrictions on conventional weapons. In 8 years, all restrictions on ICBMs. In 10 years, all restrictions on centrifuges. The net result is that 13 years, legally, they could have as many as 100 nuclear-tipped ICBMs. Is that in the best interest of the United States? No. Nor is it in the best interest of our allies that look at that as this, in many view, particularly Saudi and the Sunni world, they look at the United States siding with the Shia and siding with Iran.
We've talked about Ukraine before. In fact, if recalling, going back to when you were actually a candidate for the House, I think it's one of the first things we talked about was Ukraine and Russia. And what's interesting is you talked about how this administration basically has, not met its treaty obligations, and people don't trust us. At the same time, Trump recently said that maybe we shouldn't defend Estonia if they're attacked because they haven't paid enough into the NATO kitty. And this past weekend, Trump said some comments that suggested he didn't know what the heck was going on in the Crimea or the Ukraine. So how are we to basically think that trust could repair those alliances abroad that you argue have been frayed?
Well, the trust has been frayed, and I think the NATO itself does need to be reformed. Everyone should contribute. I agree with that point. But also the mission of Ukraine, I think, that needs to do, or mission of NATO needs to do a pivot. The clear and present threat is terrorism. And one of my friends, Colin Kilrain, he's an Admiral 3-star. He was just assigned in NATO as the head of the Special Operations. What hasn't been done is the Special Operations troops have not done a pivot to look at the threat. I don't think it's the Russians over the top is our number one threat. I think it is global terrorism at what we're seeing, definitely in Paris and in Brussels. I think we should honor our treaty obligations, but when you make a red line in the sand and then walk away from it, in the case of Syria, or in the case of our treaty obligations in Ukraine, it makes our allies very, very nervous that should that line walk towards them, are we going to hold our treaty obligations? And we are stronger as a nation and stronger as a people in the world being allies. That means being good allies, honoring our treaty obligations, honoring our commitment, and holding it. And what is our commitment for? Is to promote economic stability, to promote freedom. And I'll go back to John F. Kennedy. When he said in his inaugural address that we would pay any price and bear any burden in the defense of liberty, that was a sounding a stake about American policy from 1960 forward, is that we would always be there for the underdog. We'd always be there in the case of promoting economic stability, and we've lived through relative stability as a result of that policy.
But what are we not doing to fight ISIS? You mentioned a lot of other things, but didn't talk directly about what should we do to fight and defeat ISIS that we're not doing, in your opinion?
Well, I'm probably the last person that wants to go to war. You may know that my daughter's a Navy diver, my son-in-law's a Navy SEAL. But if we have to go to war, you go to war to win. That means you give the troops the right training, the right equipment, and the right rules of engagement to win decisively in the field of battle. Today, our troops are enormously frustrated because they don't feel they have the right rules of engagement to win. Case in point, when we have troops in contact with the enemy and we have assets overhead that are capable of defending our troops, the ground force commander doesn't have the ability to call that fire without it going through a series of filters to determine whether the collateral damage, whether or not what building it is, to identify. That is unique in that it puts our troops at greater risk. And our troops don't feel that if they get in an engagement, case in point Benghazi, 13 hours calling for help, none was given. Case in point with Sergeant McClintock in Afghanistan, in combat, engaged with the enemy, could not get air support because someone else behind a desk is making decisions based on optics, based on...
But what are you saying as far as what we should be doing there? I understand what you're saying about the protocol. I'm just wondering, are you saying we should have more troops on the ground there? Are you saying, what in terms of a military strategy, what do you think we should be doing that we're not?
In Syria, one is the Middle East, I don't think it can be solved without addressing Syria. One is that we have to identify who's on what side. Clearly in Iraq, you have now Iranian troops, the Iranian Shia that are maneuvering inside the territory of Iraq. But in Syria, I do think we should have a zone of sanctuary. Rather than having 3.5 million refugees, pour out of Syria, and unless there's a sanctuary where the civilian force feels a relative safety, this could spell out across. So I do think America should lead. That means lead militarily, but we can't do it alone. We have to convince our allies, particularly our Sunni allies, that we have the resolve and commitment to stay. Right now they don't trust us, and Saudi views our policy as pro-Iranian, so we have to cut that, go back to ensuring that our allies will stand with us, and then if you take Sunni-held territory, militarily we can do that easy, you need a stay-behind force that is Sunni, that will give an impression that this is a global commitment and an allied and a coalition force rather than just a U.S. Invasion of a crusade type.
Does that mean boots on the ground in Syria?
We have boots on the ground now.
More boots?
Yes.
More boots.
If we want to win. And this is where the discussion is that if you're going to place our troops in harm's way, then do it in a meaningful manner that'll move the needle. But by sprinkling a few special operations folks there, if it only would take 50 special operations troops, then the problem is not that bad. The problem is that bad, and it's spilling over. Mosul is an issue. Our Kurds friends are an issue, and now it's spilling over into Turkey about a failed coup that has great global consequences, because we're watching Turkey move over towards an Islamic state away from the traditional secular. You look at the stability in the region, and Turkey adds a lot about stability. And if Turkey moves over where it becomes more unstable as it is, you'll look at the past 8 years. We turned our back on Egypt. The ISIS has spilled out of Syria and into Iraq. You have an emboldened Iran that is now moving, I think, to recreate Prussia or Persia, and now you have a very unstable Turkey. This is a recipe for disaster.
I want to switch gears a little bit here. Let's talk about the campaign that you're in right now. You're running against Denise Juneau, of course. Why should voters pick you instead of Ms. Juneau? What are some of the main contrasts you see and the main reasons for your re-election?
Well, I think the contrast between the candidates and positions are pretty distinct. I'm pro-gun, I'm pro-coal, I'm pro-energy, I'm pro-economy, I'm less government. I think that to solve a lot of our problems, we need to give more flexibility to the front line rather than holding the decision point in D.C. or the faceless bureaucracy. Even public lands. I think I voted 17 times not sell or transfer public lands. What I am for is better management. And I did sponsor the Resilient Federal Forest Act. My opponent delivered a 5-point plan. 3 points on that were bills that I sponsored. I think a further look would be 5 out of 5, because the problem we face in Hamilton, I was there recently, the woods are burning down. We spent $2 billion last year fighting forest fires. The Forest Service alone is 71 million acres behind in just removing dead and dying timber and treatment. And status quo is not working. And so I think it is time to shake it up, give the foresters more authority, reward collaborations. Montana should be proud. We lead the country in collaborative efforts, 17. But we also lead lawsuits.
On that subject, I think everyone agrees that we have a problem with the Forest Service budget and fighting forest fires, and you'd like to isolate that money so we don't have the other duties like taking care of timber sales, taking that money. Why can't Congress pass just that thing? Why are Republicans mostly putting in things like poison pill amendments to restrict litigation, whatever? Why not just pass that one thing? Why do we have to?
Well, just throwing more money at it, I think you should get at the core of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the Resilient Federal Forest Act does address the recalculation so the Forest Service doesn't have to spend all their budget on fighting forest fires. By the way, the Forest Service budget, the first expense is fighting forest fires in magnitude.
That's right.
The second expense, litigation. And anything they have left goes with traditional forest management, roads and systems. I think we need more scientists in the woods and less lawyers. But status quo is not working. And when you see the scale of the fires and the scale of the destruction, on one side, people would like to see the roads shut down and rather we'll watch the forest burn down rather than to harvest one tree. On the other side is the federal government should not have any estate at all. I think Montana is, look, we love our public lands. We love the outdoor experience. We love public access. We love to hunt on our public lands. Let's work together and manage them better. I'm a Teddy Roosevelt Republican. We live in the shadow in Montana a lot of the public of Teddy Roosevelt's legacy. That means look out 100 years, make sure we protect our forests in perpetuity. You can have a working forest just fine, but that's multiple use and management that is the conservation ethic of what Teddy Roosevelt and Pinchot first established.
It's interesting you bring that up because, of course, I've heard this discussion of the Teddy Roosevelt Republican from you before. So let me ask you a couple questions about that. Well, the first question I want to ask, one thing Teddy Roosevelt did do, as president is he used the Antiquities Act aggressively to put aside a lot of spaces, including the Grand Canyon, which originally was a national monument. So do you support an aggressive use of the Antiquities Act by the president to set aside and create new national monuments?
Well, I support the Antiquities Act, but to me, where we're at today is that an Antiquities Act is setting aside something that's special, something that in perpetuity, a smaller battle site, a unique experience. But to land grab millions of acres outside of Congress, I think at the point this time, I think is inappropriate. For instance, the CMR in Montana. There's talk about the president coming in and doing an Antiquities Act. I think it's better at this point in time to make sure you have involvement, a collaborative effort. What I'm particularly concerned about, quite frankly, is we have two beautiful parks, the treasures, national treasures. This year is likely that our number of people and visitors will be at over records, and there's a capacity that our parks can hold and have an experience of a park. So we have to be as bold as Teddy Roosevelt and look at 100 years and look at the public property around the parks and look at infrastructure. Our trail systems need to be updated. The park itself is over $10 billion behind in infrastructure. But if you look at the public lands around the park, now's the time to look out ahead and invest in some infrastructure, improve the trails to relieve some of the pressure on our parks. And if we don't prioritize infrastructure in our parks and those public grounds around it, we're going to be behind, and we're going to continue to have the scale fires we do, and we'll put our national treasures at risk.
This summer I was fortunate enough to actually go to the Teddy Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, and I don't know if you've been there, but one of the sites that's protected is the Elkhorn Ranch, which was Teddy's ranch. It's really hard to get to. You gotta swing around. My question to you is it's a lovely site, it's beautiful and it's tranquil. You come out of there and up on the hill, there's a pump jack going that Teddy Roosevelt never would have seen. So what do we need to do? I mean, do you think we should try to restrict sight lines? And you can even see the flares from the oil development in North Dakota. What's the balance that we need to have between that development and protecting these wonderful places?
Well, a pump jack will come and go. A wind farm's forever. And I think you do need to be sensitive about it. If an experience in the park, you look what's around the park and be sensitive to it to make sure the experience. Landscapes are important. They're important down in Dillon in that national forest. You're right. I think when Teddy Roosevelt decided to put under federal protection 320 million acres, he did it at a time when he saw the West rapidly diminishing. And I think it is his legacy is important. And I think our legacy to protect the view sheds to a degree are important. You have to be very careful about it. Not every view shed is equal importance. Without a power line or a railroad, we're not going to have an economy either. But on view sheds, if we were to take Colstrip, for instance, and take that down and replace it with an alternate energy like wind, you're talking about 200 square miles of wind farms. So that needs to be taken into consideration as well. And coal to our economy is enormously important. If we lose Colstrip, then we also lose manufacturing and jobs like the refinery in Billings, the refinery in Great Falls, the mine in Butte, Malt Europe. A lot of our manufacturing companies that provide jobs demand and need low-cost energy because Montana generally manufactures not for folks living in Montana, but other markets. And we have to make up those transportation costs somewhere. We have to pay our people a good wage. And so a big difference between my opponent and I is I support energy, all the above, but I am a staunch supporter of coal because coal at the moment provides the low-cost energy we need. Without Colstrip, our economy will tumble.
What does that, all of the above, you said that a lot, what does that mean in terms of policy? What should Congress be doing or not be doing? And also on coal, you mentioned coal, of course you're pro-coal. What about climate change? Do you believe in it? Do you think we should do something to combat it?
Okay, the first point about all the above is I think Congress should aggressively invest in research and development. There's some promising technologies, just the promising technologies in Montana about storage of electricity. But before you go into the market, I think you need to make sure that the energy itself is efficient, it's cost effective, reliable. And sometimes when you subsidize energies that are not cost effective, what happens is the ratepayer and industry pays more and we become less competitive. Global warming. There is no doubt that the climate is changing. It has always changed, but we don't understand the changes currently. Secondly, man has had an influence. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The dispute is, what is the influence and what can we do about it? In the case of the Clean Power Act, Gina McCarthy, who's the EPA, came before Congress, and by their own studies and tests, they looked at it, their models, as that the effect of not implementing the act would have the net effect of raising the sea level the same thickness as 3 pieces of paper. 3 pieces of paper, by their own model. Now, I don't think their model's accurate. They think their model is more accurate than I do, but 3 pieces of paper in thickness. And yet we're going to dismantle 40% of our energy grid, make our costs of energy in this country rise, having the effect of making our economy less competitive. And look, we can't pay our people the same as China can, but certainly we can all agree on a couple things. One, it is better to produce energy here under reasonable regulation than watch it be produced overseas with no regulation. And I've seen it. I've seen energy development in Africa, I've seen energy development in the Middle East, and we don't want that model. Secondly, it is better to make sure we have an economy here that creates jobs and invests in research and development, because that's how you move ahead. And I think global warming overall, we should be very, very cautious, because let's say it's a 1 out of 6 chance that global warming is true. Let's say that as an example. Well, you wouldn't put 1 round in a gun and spin it and go, well, you only have 1 out of 6 chances, go ahead and squeeze the trigger. So I think we have to be prudent, cautious, and step by step make energy cleaner, better, but do so in a logical manner. Invest in infrastructure, efficiency, and research and development. I think that's where we can make the best gains.
We've got about 30 seconds left, so I just want to ask you one question. Going back to the land dispute between you and Juneau. All right, you say that Juneau has voted for selling land, but that's also under the Land Bank program, which you also voted for when you were in the state Senate, right? Isn't that correct?
Well, what she has said was that the bill I supported transfers and sells public land. That is absolutely false.
And that's the
verbatim.
And that's the House bill.
That's correct. And the Billings Gazette verbatim has said that's false. That would be a lie. And I have never voted to sell land on there. I think the land banking is a good model, but I've never voted to sell land. And I look at examples where I have supported public land, public partnerships, the Swan. I think that's a wonderful thing where they came in, still a working forest. That's an example. There's a lot of examples around Montana of good land management policies, not all doom and gloom, but status quo as a whole is not working.
So the end result, at the end of the day, sounds like you don't support selling public land, and I think we're going to have to end it on that particular note today. Thanks for joining us on Face the State. And next time, Mike and I hope to talk a little bit about the politics we're going to see in the fall election. Till then, thank you.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.